Hello, everyone. Has the alliance between the United States and NATO come to an end? These days, Trump's dissatisfaction with NATO countries has become increasingly apparent. In an interview with the Daily Telegraph, he said he is seriously considering withdrawing the United States from NATO. He once again referred to NATO as a paper tiger and also said that Iran is a test. We stand up for them, but when we need them to stand up for us, they don't. And at an event today, Trump criticised NATO, saying that this alliance has a hostile attitude towards the United States. Trump commented on this both rationally and emotionally. White House officials have stated that Europe is no longer considered a reliable defence partner because during the Strait of Hormuz crisis, Europe refused to provide even the most basic rights to use bases and to fly over their airspace. Secretary of State Rubio also described NATO as a one-way street. In an interview, he said, "Why are we still in NATO? We need to ask this question. We've spent trillions of dollars stationing troops in Europe, so why is it that when we need help, we're not even allowed to use their bases?" So, is the United States really going to withdraw from NATO? Why doesn't Europe support the US and Israel in going to war with Iran? Well, today, let's have a chat about the US and NATO, this alliance, and what sort of state it's actually in at the moment. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please do subscribe and turn on the little bell so you don't miss any of our programs. Right, back to our topic. What has NATO done to make its American allies so furious? Over the past few days, a number of things have happened. One of them is that France refused to allow US military aircraft carrying weapons to Israel. Another incident was that Italy did not agree to allow US bombers to use its bases or fly through its airspace. Spain also closed its airspace and refused to let the US military use its bases. Even Switzerland, which is not a NATO member, rejected US reconnaissance flights on the grounds of neutrality. Both Britain and Germany stated, "This is not our war." Although Britain reluctantly agreed to allow the US to use its bases, reports indicated that the approval process was taking longer and longer. In fact, these actions did not require the Allies to participate directly in the war. It was merely about the most basic logistical support. The original purpose of NATO was collective defence, and the United States has long provided the nuclear umbrella, intelligence and strategic airlift for NATO. However, when the US needed Allied bases to counter the Iranian nuclear threat, a threat that was already directly targeting Europe, Europeans still said, "This is not our war." This was something many Americans found unacceptable. Of course, just to clarify, when we talk about Europe here, the main source of American dissatisfaction is with the Western European countries. As for the Eastern European countries, those that have suffered under the scourge of communism, they seem to be a bit more clear-headed. On social media, there is currently a heated debate about the relationship between the United States and NATO. Several conservative commentators have sharply criticised NATO. Among them, Singaporean journalist Melissa Chen wrote a lengthy article that has resonated widely. Her post begins by stating bluntly, "Let's be honest, Europe has been riding on America's security coattails for decades, even if by 2025 all NATO member states finally meet the 2% of GDP defence spending target, this fact remains unchanged." However, compared to financial contributions, the real rift lies at the ideological level, and the Iran crisis has completely exposed this. He goes on to say that Europe worships endless committee consultations and so-called predictability. Macron, for instance, even regards these as virtues, but in Trump's eyes, this amounts to paralysis. His style is to issue clear threats, identify a target, and then take action. Americans value conviction and purpose, whereas Europe is immersed in bureaucratic rituals and lofty yet hollow abstractions. Of course, Americans may make mistakes when they take action, but Europe never stops to consider what the cost of inaction might be. At present, Iran is holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage, choking off the route for 20% of the world's oil shipments. At the same time, its proxies are still firing missiles at allies and cruise ships. If this doesn't count as an imminent threat to the global economy, of which European businesses are a part, then I don't know what does. Yet, when Washington requests to use European bases to carry out these tasks, bases which have been defended by the United States for decades, Europe's response is hesitation and endless deliberation. If even a regime with apocalyptic ambitions, one that strikes at Gulf states and threatens the world's energy lifeline, can't be recognised as an enemy worth confronting, then what does our so-called alliance actually mean? Europe likes to strike a tough pose against Russia, issuing condemnations, making speeches, and imposing sanctions that rarely inflict any real damage on the Russian economy. And now, here lies an opportunity to take concrete action. Trump has not asked for ground troops to be deployed, nor has he proposed more aggressive measures. He is merely requesting the use of infrastructure that the United States has spent decades building. But Europe can't even manage this. It is, metaphorically speaking, a paper tiger of an alliance, relying on Washington to bleed and pay, while Brussels and London hold meeting after meeting to discuss matters endlessly. If Europe refuses to regard Iran as a threat that must be confronted, yet feels perfectly comfortable relying on American power to keep the straits open and ensure energy supplies, then this alliance is, in truth, already little more than a name. This post is so incisive that some people commented below accusing me of supporting NATO, but I simply cannot refute a single fact or argument Melissa Chen has listed. Mark Thiessen, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and former speechwriter for President Bush, replied in the comments saying, He said that many long-time supporters of NATO are now saying the same thing. He himself once helped Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic join NATO, but refusing to let us use their bases or fly over their airspace is inexcusable. They also failed to provide assistance on the Strait of Hormuz issue. No one was asking them to bomb Iran, just to let us use their bases and to assist in escorting ships. If even this can't be done, then NATO has no reason to exist. A post by Silicon Valley investor Bill Ackman has also been widely discussed. He pointed out from social, technological and economic perspectives the grave situation Europe is now facing. He said that Europe is heading down a path of self-destruction. Millions of immigrants are pouring in unchecked, placing a heavy burden on their welfare systems. These countries are bringing violence and terrorism to Europe's shores. Moreover, one city after another is seeing local governance taken over, and anti-capitalist policies are making it difficult for businesses to adjust their workforce in a rapidly changing competitive environment, an environment that is evolving even faster due to the development of AI. The business environment and tax system are completely at odds with startups, resulting in no progress or innovation in the field of artificial intelligence, nor can they obtain the computational resources necessary for competition. At a time when energy demand is soaring, they have become dependent on energy imports due to the green movement. Now, as we are striving to eliminate the nuclear and ballistic missile threats that Iran already possesses, which threaten Europe, and after having committed nearly $200 billion to assist Ukraine, Europe, however, has chosen to abandon the United States when we have only asked for limited assistance, namely the right to use bases and to fly over their airspace. NATO is no longer of any use. Europe's defence burden is about to increase significantly, while their economies will continue to fall further and further behind. In short, Europe needs to wake up before it is too late, although it may already be too late now. I think what Bill Ackman said actually describes a very serious situation. If the United States and NATO were truly to go their separate ways, the blow and severe impact on Europe would definitely be much greater than on the United States. So what about from a legal perspective? Can Trump withdraw from NATO? Many people refer to a supplementary clause in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, which stipulates that the president cannot unilaterally withdraw from NATO and would require the approval of 2/3 of the Senate or legislation passed by Congress. So according to this clause, it would seem that the president cannot unilaterally announce a withdrawal from NATO. However, Senator Redpool has pointed out that, according to Article 2 of the US Constitution, the president has full authority to withdraw from any treaty without needing the approval of the Senate. He believes that the amendment in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act can't override the Constitution. Interestingly, Rubio was actually one of the initiators of this amendment back in the day. One wonders whether he has any regrets about it now. However, Rubio himself did not shy away from admitting in an interview that he has always been a strong supporter of NATO as a NATO country. This time, though, the actions taken have made him start to question whether this alliance is a one-way street. However, even without formally withdrawing, many analysts believe that Trump still has plenty of room for manoeuvre. For example, he could drastically reduce the size of stationed troops, cut contributions to the joint budget, sign bilateral agreements with individual countries, redirect resources towards the Indo-Pacific region, or adjust aid to Europe, and so on. So what do you think? After the end of the Iran war, will Trump make major adjustments to the NATO alliance? You're welcome to share your views in the comment section. I think a key question here is, why did Europe refuse to support the US strike against Iran? I saw someone raise this very central issue, saying, the mystery I can never unravel is why the UK, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Canada and Australia all unanimously believe that confronting the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, whose ayatollahs are about to acquire nuclear weapons, is not the right course of action. Iran, which controls the world's energy lifeline, is apparently none of their concern. Why have the West's millennia of memory, experience, philosophy and logic suddenly evaporated? I believe this gets to the heart of the matter. Europe can no longer recognise evil, or rather the standards by which good and evil are measured have been turned upside down. This is not simply a matter of whether one likes Trump or not. In terms of values, today's Europe, or more specifically Western Europe, is moving in the opposite direction to the United States, which is now returning to traditional values. I saw an analysis by a user on Twitter asking why Europe is becoming increasingly left-wing. There was a particular passage with which I wholeheartedly agree. He said that Europe has a deep-rooted tradition of leftist thought, and this underlying tone determines the basic direction of its social evolution. From the equality of the French Revolution to the social democracy of the 19th century and the May 1968 protests, Europe has always been a laboratory for radical social change. Since the mid-20th century, the European academic world has carried out profound criticism of capitalism and traditional values. This cultural influence, spread through the education system and the media, has made social fairness, minority rights, global citizenship awareness and so on, what is referred to as social fairness, the default political correctness in mainstream society. This Twitter user believes that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Europe entered into the illusion of a peace dividend. The United States provided a nuclear umbrella, allowing Europe to drastically cut military spending and instead invest in welfare, environmental protection and multiculturalism. After the Cold War threat disappeared, the theory of the end of history became popular and conflict was seen as a thing of the past, with national will evolving into humanitarian performances. As for the reflection on the Second World War, it pushed Europe to take human rights to the extreme. They opened their doors to welcome immigrants, yet overlooked cultural conflicts and the collapse of the welfare system. So the result is that, for security, Europe relies on the United States and pursues demilitarization. Economically, it chases after a utopian, borderless ideal. Culturally, left-wing experiments are turned into ideology, forming a perfect closed loop, utopia. The well-known British conservative political commentator and writer Douglas Murray gives a detailed analysis of this in his book, The Strange Death of Europe. He believes that Europe is in the process of committing suicide, mainly for two reasons. One is that large-scale immigration, combined with extremely low birth rates, is changing the population structure. The other is Europe's attitude towards its own beliefs, traditions, and legitimacy. They have lost confidence. Murray points out that the European elite's reflection on colonial history, massacres and the Second World War has evolved into a profound sense of guilt and historical exhaustion, making it difficult for them to defend their own culture. He writes that Europeans cannot become Indians or Chinese, yet they are expected to believe that anyone in the world who comes to Europe can become European. The book goes on to analyse that Europe's post-war secularisation and post-Christian society have led to traditional values being replaced by discourses of power. But what about power? Without faith in God or a philosophical foundation, it is difficult for power to endure. When faced with clear threats, Europe tends to regard them as complex geopolitical issues rather than crises that require action. Murray warns this exhaustion has caused Europe to fail to respond to crises, potentially accelerating its decline. I believe interests are replacing traditional values. The distinction between good and evil has shifted. Our standards for what is constructive no longer rest on right and wrong, but are swayed by various interests and distorted political correctness. This leads to indecision and stalling action. Regarding the recent Strait of Hormuz issue, Britain convened 35 countries to consult. As for France, Macron's approach was to negotiate with Iran. Macron stated that the strait must be reopened, but this could only be achieved through coordination with Iran. The world cannot accept a strait that can be opened or closed at will overnight. Next, a netizen sharply commented, if all you can do is negotiate with them, isn't the opening and closing still entirely up to them? This so-called negotiation, aren't you just making empty promises? Moreover, the latest news is that France has sided with France and Russia, and that the United Nations vetoed a proposal from Arab countries to use force to keep the strait open. This proposal. France has now sunk to the point of siding with China and Russia. I really think the world is changing far too quickly. Of course, even if this approach isn't ideal, it's still much better than Obama sending $1.7 billion in cash to Iran by plane. Yesterday, Trump brought this matter up again in his speech, and I don't think that's unreasonable at all. This isn't a matter of government inaction, but rather of encouraging terrorists. I've seen people familiar with the situation in Iran say that the funds Obama provided to the Iranian regime not only helped them further develop their missile and nuclear capabilities, but were also used to support local terrorist groups, including Hamas and the Houthi forces, greatly strengthening Iran's bargaining position. Such an action can't simply be explained away as foolishness. Obama's administration caused deep and lasting harm to American society. As time goes on, more and more Americans are coming to realise this. Now, there's another issue that's been hotly debated in English-speaking circles these past couple of days, namely whether the Chinese Communist Party is a beneficiary of this war. The Economist, for instance, published an article in the past couple of days claiming that China hopes to emerge victorious from the Iran war. The subheading reads, "When your enemy is making a mistake, do not interrupt him." In other words, the Chinese Communist Party believes that when an enemy, like the United States, is making a mistake, they should not interfere. And as for the article itself, it says that several Chinese diplomats and scholars were interviewed, and their view is that the Iran war is a grave mistake committed by the United States. I find it rather amusing, really. The Economist goes to interview America's biggest rival, and the conclusion is that America's rival thinks America is making a mistake. You hardly need to conduct interviews to arrive at that conclusion, do you? Would Chinese Communist Party scholars ever praise the United States for doing something well or getting it right? Within the Chinese Communist Party system, there are no independent viewpoints or critical thinking, or even if there are, they can't be expressed publicly, especially those who are allowed to be interviewed by foreign media. Basically, they can only repeat narratives that align with the official perspective. So this article by The Economist has, in effect, become a mouthpiece for the CCP's external propaganda. Michael Lucci, founder of the US policy think tank State Armor, made a pointedly sarcastic remark, saying, "We interviewed a bunch of Chinese intelligence officers, and they all said the US had made a huge mistake, so we obediently reprinted the CCP's propaganda." A researcher at the Hudson Institute, now known in think tank circles as the Queen of the Middle East, responded to The Economist's article in a post, saying that all the viewpoints in the article were completely wrong and that she would write an article to refute them. Zen Every Bull reposted an article he had previously written. The title of his article stated that a war in Iran would not consolidate China's status as a superpower. In this article, he argues that China's not the true beneficiary. He says that, in terms of energy, China used to obtain oil from Iran and Venezuela at discounted prices, but is now forced to pay full price. Russia's worsening finances and Turkmenistan's diversification of exports have both driven up China's energy costs. In the fields of clean energy and bulk commodities, Western tariff barriers are rapidly closing off opportunities for arbitrage. China is also facing domestic shortages in the supply of fertilizer, sulfur, and helium, and the idea of the petrol yuan is equally fragile. The renminbi accounts for only about 8.5% of global transactions, and Gulf countries are still clinging tightly to dollar assets. More importantly, China's previous assistance to Iran's missile technology is now threatening its Gulf allies, causing Saudi Arabia and the UAE to turn to Washington for help rather than Beijing. He pointed out that Beijing had previously brokered the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023. At the same time, however, it provided Iran with export-controlled dual-use technology for its drone and missile programs through a network of intermediary companies. As a result, 366 Chinese and Hong Kong entities have been added to the US sanctions list targeting Iran. So, to sum up, this conflict has caused China to lose access to cheap energy, expose issues regarding the reliability of its allies, and accelerated Western restrictions on its industries. I've also seen analysts suggest that if the US keeps the war in Iran costly, chaotic, and drawn out, it could actually benefit Beijing. So the real question is quite simple. Will this war become yet another entanglement that drains American power and leaves the region uglier than before, or will it turn into a coercive strike operation? In other words, will it weaken Iran, force it to reach a settlement, maintain the flow of energy, and end without an occupation? Now, it seems that the second possibility is more likely. In the former case, Beijing would be right, but in the latter, Beijing would simply be putting on a brave face. The Economist headline, "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." This is not an analysis, but rather a wish. The Chinese Communist Party hopes this will be America's mistake and wants the whole world to believe it too. However, a more accurate interpretation is that the Chinese Communist Party is cheering for America's overextension. The Chinese Communist Party is deeply fearful of an out-of-control energy crisis, and it is actually more afraid of a swift American victory than it admits on the surface. The Economist report is amplifying the narrative preferred by the Chinese Communist Party rather than providing any kind of impartial strategic truth. I think this interpretation is quite accurate. Judging from the current development of the situation and Trump's speech last night, the war will basically end before the end of April. As for Iran, even if the regime doesn't collapse, it will be greatly weakened. After the war, the landscape of the Middle East will change dramatically, with Israel joining forces with Arab countries to suppress the threat from Iran. Next, the United States will be able to focus its energy and resources even more on dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, which is not an outcome the CCP would like to see.